feeling like you need a helicopter view of the global economy, how it all fits together, but without getting, totally bogged down.
Yeah, wading through endless reports isn't exactly fun.
Exactly. So you're in the right place. Today, we're aiming for that high-altitude perspective. We're diving into the framework of the renowned investor Ray Dalio, specifically because you asked for a way to understand the big picture minus all the overwhelming complexity.
And Dalio's great for that. He spent decades, literally decades, looking at economic history, trying to find those recurring patterns that drive things.
Right, the cycles.
Yeah, the cycles. His whole approach gives you a really valuable lens for making sense of, well, the pretty turbulent economic waters we seem to be in right now.
For sure. So our mission, if you will, in this deep dive is to unpack Dalio's way of seeing these major economic shifts and, crucially, the changing world order. We're drawing from a recent interview with him, plus his really insightful videos, How the Economic Machine Works.
The classics.
And principles for dealing with the changing world order. Think of this as your kind of streamlined guide to the key forces shaping our economic future right now.
And we've pulled the key stuff from those sources, the interview transcript, the video transcripts, to really focus the analysis for you.
Okay, so Dalio sees the economy a bit like a machine, right, with interconnected parts.
Okay.
Or maybe a chessboard.
Yeah, both analogies work. A machine driven by cause and effect, or a chessboard with different players making moves. And he's identified 5 sort of major forces that he thinks are fundamental to how it all operates.
5 forces. Okay, let's get into those. The first one he highlights, it's the money, credit, and debt force. Now, money, okay, but what's the key insight about credit and debt here?
Well, the crucial point really is that credit is essentially buying power you use now that you promise to pay back later.
So future money.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that creates debt. This whole cycle of borrowing and repayment, it fuels economic activity, makes the economy grow.
But there's a catch.
Always. The trouble starts when debt grows too large, compared to income. Then you need this often painful adjustment process.
Like if everyone maxes out their credit cards.
Exactly. Eventually, there has to be a reckoning, a deleveraging. It's a fundamental cycle.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just cash, it's the whole borrowing system. Force number 2 is internal order and disorder. Sounds political.
It is. This force looks at the dynamics within a nation, between different political groups.
Like Democrats and Republicans in the U.S.
Typically, yeah. When these groups are in really intense conflict, it can disrupt the stability you need for a healthy economy. Dalio actually noted the recent orderly transition of power in the U.S. towards what he called the hard right as a pretty significant development here.
Interesting. So how much division or unity a country has internally is a major economic factor. Okay, third force, international order, how countries deal with each other. And Dalio sees a big shift happening here too.
A really big one, yeah. He argues we're moving away from that system we had after World War II, the rule-based order.
With the UN, World Bank, WTO, that stuff.
Exactly. Supported by those multinational organizations, he sees a trend now towards more of an America first kind of approach.
And that puts pressure on other countries.
Definitely. Puts pressure on them to align their interests more with the U.S. For you listening, this could mean more uncertainty in international trade, maybe more focus on where your goods are actually made.
Right. So the global playbook is changing. Then fourth force, acts of nature. This seems, well, obvious.
It is, but hugely impactful. Things like droughts, floods, pandemics, they have direct, significant economic effects.
Disrupting supply chains.
Affecting resources, requiring massive economic adjustments. I mean, the recent pandemic is a perfect, if unfortunate, example of how a natural event can just send shockwaves everywhere.
Yeah, no kidding.
And looking ahead, climate change clearly falls under this. It's likely to be a growing factor, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Okay, so things outside our control with huge economic fallout. And finally, the fifth force, technology, new inventions, innovation.
Exactly. Human ingenuity, right. It constantly reshapes the economic landscape.
Yeah.
But, and this is important, Dalio emphasizes technology doesn't operate in isolation.
Yeah, connects to the others.
It interacts with and influences all the other 4 forces. Think about automation, that's technology impacting jobs, which relates to internal order.
Or new energy tech affecting international relations.
Which is international order.
And maybe our response to climate change.
Which is acts of nature.
See.
It's all interconnected.
Got it. Okay, so these five forces are always moving, always interacting. Let's dig a bit deeper now into this shift in the world order. Geopolitically, Dalio sees the recent U.S. political changes as more than just domestic stuff, like preparation.
That's a key part of his analysis, yeah.
Hmm,
He interprets these internal reforms, partly at least, as positioning the U.S. for potential conflict on the global stage,
conflict with who?
particularly concerning the rise of China and his allies like Russia, Iran, North Korea. He anticipates changes in how the U.S. government itself will be run.
Like a business. He said something like a capitalist business. What does that mean, practically?
Well, he expects to see things like more emphasis on adopting new tech within government itself, a drive for efficiency,
Cutting red tape.
maybe,
Hmm.
and implementing what's called industrial policy. It's basically the government taking a more active role in directing certain industries. Plus, deregulation and new laws focus squarely on boosting productivity and U.S. competitiveness, especially in critical tech sectors.
Right, the technology war idea. It's not just about cool gadgets.
Not at all. In Dalio's view, leading in technology translates directly into huge economic and military advantages today.
Huh.
This competition is a major, major driver of international relations and trade policy now.
Okay. And he contrasts this new America First direction with the previous moral-driven world order. How does that change U.S. relationships?
Well, moving away from that multilateral, rules-based approach towards America First, Dalio thinks it leads to more uh, strong-armed conflict, more reliance on muscular power.
So less cooperation.
Potentially. Other countries are less likely to just automatically align with the U.S. They're increasingly prioritizing their own national interests first. You might see this play out in, say, trade talks or diplomatic spats.
And this connects to the rise of BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They're not just like developing economies anymore.
What's significant now is that BRICS, and it represents a huge chunk of the world's population, like 85%, is increasingly seen as this coalition of countries aiming to reduce their dependence on the U.S.-dominated financial system.
So creating their own system.
They're exploring alternative ways to
Yeah.
trade, yeah. But Dalio is a bit skeptical about them creating a true alternative to established reserve currencies, like the U.S. dollar, anytime soon. Maybe alternative mediums of exchange, but not necessarily a store of wealth yet.
Okay, so lots of countries looking out for, number one, not eager to get dragged into U.S. conflicts. Let's pivot back home then. The domestic impact of America First. Like those potential 20% tariffs you hear about, that could really hit our wallets, couldn't it?
Oh, it certainly could. Dalio suggests this signals a more, let's say, assertive U.S. leadership style domestically. But there are potential downsides.
Like what?
Risks of the U.S. becoming more isolated internationally. Maybe facing challenges managing inflation if imports get expensive, and potentially weakening the long-term value of U.S. debt and the dollar itself.
So trying for self-reliance could make imports pricier and maybe hurt the dollar's standing globally.
That's the potential trade-off, yes.
Is there a bigger strategy here? A long game behind these potentially painful short-term things?
The thinking, it seems, the longer-term goal is to strengthen the U.S. economy domestically. Bring manufacturing back, shore up the dollar, possibly as preparation for increased global tensions or even conflict.
And part of that might be splitting the tech world.
Could be. Moving towards essentially two separate tech ecosystems, one U.S.-centric, one China-centric, driven by mistrust, and a desire for self-sufficiency if things go bad.
That wouldn't be very efficient globally, would it?
Probably not the most efficient, no. But it could enhance each side's independence, their resilience.
And that ties into goals like 20% U.S. chip production by 2030, especially with the whole Taiwan situation.
Exactly. Boosting domestic chip production is a strategic hedge against relying on potentially vulnerable foreign suppliers. And those tariffs, if they happen, they'd likely mean the end of the U.S. being the world supermarket for cheap stuff. It's a definite shift towards protectionism, aiming to boost American industries.
Like other countries have done in the past.
Yeah. Dalio draws parallels to strategies used by, say, Germany after World War I, or Japan with its more state-controlled economy focused on self-reliance.
Okay. Now, Dalio also mentions this idea of the revenge of the working class. How does that fit into all these big economic shifts?
Well, his view is that some of the recent political shifts we've seen are partly fueled by the fact that real wages for a lot of working class people hadn't really gone up much since, like, the 1980s.
Wow, that long.
Yeah. And that leads to this feeling that, their kids' future might not be better than theirs. That breeds frustration, anger, and contributes to the rise of populist movements.
So even with this long-term goal of a stronger U.S., how might the average person react now if prices start climbing because of tariffs?
Dalio acknowledges that, yeah, there could definitely be a negative short-term reaction to higher costs. But he also points to the argument for tariffs,
Which is?
that they could generate a lot of tax revenue, maybe even more than wealth taxes, some argue. And they create a sort of protected space for American businesses.
And the idea is to reinvest that money.
The idea, theoretically, is that this revenue could then be plowed back into improving U.S. productivity, which, again, theoretically, could offset those higher costs down the line. It's basically a bet on future productivity gains making up for the immediate price hikes.
A big bet. Okay, makes sense. Now, let's switch gears a bit. Dalio is pretty critical of modern monetary theory, MMT. For anyone listening who isn't familiar, what's his main beef with it?
In essence, Dalio thinks MMT just doesn't work in the real world because it kind of overlooks the fundamental relationship between borrowers and lenders. Savers, creditors, they need a real return on their money, right, through interest rates.
Okay.
Simply printing more money, which MMT sometimes advocates, doesn't magically create more stuff, more productivity. It just increases the amount of money chasing the same amount of goods and services.
Which means inflation or devaluing the money you have.
Exactly. He sees it as just shifting wealth around, not creating real value, and it potentially undermines sensible lending.
Yeah.
So the bottom line for him is printing money isn't a free lunch. It doesn't create real value and can hurt savers through inflation.
And he warns about this tightrope act with interest rates too low fuels inflation, too high crushes debtors.
Right. And if the returns on savings, like in government bonds, get too low because rates are suppressed or money is being printed.
People will put their money elsewhere.
Precisely. They'll look for other assets, gold, maybe other currencies, whatever holds value better. That weakens demand for things like government bonds,
Right.
just when the government might be needing to sell more of them.
Which leads us to his call for a Manhattan Project for the economy. A big, coordinated effort to tackle debt and inflation. He calls it beautiful deleveraging. What does that actually mean in plain English?
Beautiful deleveraging. It sounds nice, right? Basically, it's Dalio's term for reducing a country's huge debt load without causing a total economic meltdown, like a deep depression.
Yeah.
His ideal scenario involves a carefully balanced mix of things. Some austerity, like cutting spending.
Okay.
Some debt restructuring, maybe writing some debt off or changing terms. Some wealth redistribution, like taxes. And, yes, printing some money. But all done in a coordinated, strategic way to minimize the pain and get the economy back on a sustainable track.
And his vision for this Manhattan Project?
His preferred path involved bipartisan cooperation, bringing together the smartest people, the moderates from both sides, not the extremes, to engineer reforms that have broad public support, especially in crucial areas like, say, education reform. He even floated the idea of bipartisan cabinet.
But he admits the current political vibe seems different, more about strong loyalty than compromise.
He does. He sees that kind of bipartisan consensus as a major challenge right now. The trend seems more towards appointing people with strong ideological stances rather than, bridge builders.
And he stresses how important the beginning of an administration is, the first 100 days, the first 2 years.
Absolutely crucial. Because midterm elections loom, that initial window is when administrations typically try to push through their biggest priorities.
And the list of potential changes is huge. Immigration, trade, tech, energy, all needing to get through Congress. He expects very forceful actions.
Given that limited time frame, yeah. He anticipates a really determined push to enact significant policy changes with clear priorities.
Now, despite these big plans, Dalio still has some real worries, doesn't he? Potential downsides.
Oh, definitely. He's concerned about the risk of overdoing things, maybe neglecting the needs of certain segments of the population who get left behind by these shifts.
Like who?
Well, one specific worry he voices is whether education will really be prioritized as the fundamental reform needed to build character and capability in young people.
He sees education as key.
Absolutely. He also worries about alienating the other side politically, which could create even bigger problems down the road.
He uses this analogy, right? Like renovating a struggling company.
Yeah, he describes the current approach as potentially being like turning around a failing business, which might involve tough decisions, maybe workforce cuts, disruptions, all in the name of getting the company, or in this case the country, into better shape.
But he's concerned about a baseline, a minimum standard.
Especially a minimum standard of education and civility. particularly for people in disadvantaged communities grappling with really serious issues, gangs, poverty, bad schools. He doesn't seem to see a clear plan in the current approach to really tackle those deep-seated social problems effectively.
So he acknowledges the leaders are making tough choices, but questions if these fundamental issues are getting enough focus.
That seems to be his concern, yes.
Okay, what about the idea of shrinking government, cutting departments? Could that cause a recession, or would it maybe free up people for the private sector?
Dalio thinks the key question there is, does it improve overall productivity? The best-case scenario, he suggests, would involve adopting new tech, slashing bureaucracy, increasing efficiency. That would be positive.
What?
But it immediately raises the huge question.
Hmm.
What happens to the people whose government jobs disappear?
Right, where do they go?
He seems to kind of admire the attempt at this government efficiency revolution, but his bigger worry circles back to broad-based productivity, meaning is it making more people productive across the board? Or just improving the overall numbers while leaving a chunk of people behind?
He's worried about making currently unproductive adults productive.
Yeah, he sees that as essential to avoid social disruption if you end up with a large population that feels, well, useless economically. And he's generally pretty skeptical about big government programs being the answer, given their history of inefficiency.
Okay, so here's an interesting idea he mentioned. Using tariffs more instead of income tax to boost the private sector and maybe absorb those displaced government workers. Is that feasible?
Well, Dalio's point is that where the money comes from, tariffs or income tax, is less important than how it's used to actually raise productivity.
It comes back to the plan for the people.
Exactly. The fundamental question remains, what's the plan for the individuals displaced, whether by government cuts or, maybe more importantly, by technology?
But doesn't a stimulated private sector create jobs?
It can, yes, and that's the argument. But Dalio seems doubtful about a smooth, direct transition for everyone, especially, say, older workers with very specific public sector skills. And he makes the crucial point that technology is probably disrupting way more jobs than Chinese imports ever did.
Good point. Okay, so even with restructuring, the what happens to the workers question is a big one. Now, the markets, they seem pretty happy since the election, euphoric even.
That's true, yeah. There's been noticeable market enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Probably driven by expectations of more pro-business policies, right? Deregulation, maybe a smaller government footprint, potential tax cuts.
And that's boosted stocks, crypto.
We've seen rises in stock values, increased interest in crypto, definitely.
But is that optimism just about those business-friendly policies? Or is it also maybe assuming continued government spending, money printing, needing somewhere to park assets?
That's a fair question. Dalio acknowledges that the perception of fewer taxes, a more capitalist vibe, market benefits that aligns with his view of the anticipated direction.
Yeah.
But he keeps coming back to the point that this market optimism on its own doesn't solve the displaced worker problem.
His hope is just a stimulated private sector.
It seems to be a somewhat vague hope, yeah, that a thriving private sector will create more jobs overall. But he doesn't map out a clear, easy path for many individuals, particularly those coming from government backgrounds, to just slot right in.
And he points out how the benefits of new tech often go to a small group.
Yeah, he highlights this concentration. The gains from cutting-edge tech often accrue to a relatively small, highly skilled population. He throws out a number like maybe 3 million people and notes maybe half are immigrants.
Which leaves a lot of people potentially disrupted by tech without easy transitions.
Exactly. And that concentration plus the disruption, it raises serious questions about the social safety net, doesn't it? And the long-term productivity of the population as a whole.
Yeah, because if the safety net is the only option for many, they could just become dependent on it, right? Instead of finding productive work. He makes a pretty blunt point about the market eventually deciding value.
He does. A rather stark view that ultimately the market determines economic value. Which then leads him to ask, well, can we learn from other places? He mentions Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew.
What's the lesson from Singapore, according to Dalio?
A key takeaway for him is their intense focus, starting early, on educating young people, not just with skills, but also with civility, a sense of civic responsibility.
Because it's harder to fix later.
Much harder.
Right.
He emphasizes that trying to make older individuals productive, if they lack that fundamental foundation of skills and basic societal understanding, is incredibly difficult and expensive.
So a strong education system providing a baseline for most people is critical, a historical lesson.
He sees it as absolutely fundamental, yes.
But why does the U.S. seem to struggle so much with passing down values consistently and with education disparities?
Dalio points to a few things. One is just the strong influence of individual parents, which varies wildly. Another is the competitive nature of U.S. society affecting resources. And then there's the structure of education itself.
How it's funded locally.
Yeah, the decentralized system, often relying heavily on local property taxes. That creates huge disparities in funding between rich and poor districts, sometimes right next door to each other in the same state. You see massive differences in per-student spending.
And the environment outside school matters hugely too. Drugs, violence.
Absolutely. That has a massive impact on a child's ability to learn and thrive. It makes fixing education in disadvantaged areas much harder, much more costly. And it can create this vicious cycle, right? Poorly raised kids become parents who struggle.
He shares some pretty grim statistics sometimes, doesn't he? Dropout rates, failure rates, even in wealthy states.
He does. And he connects it to the high costs, downstream crime, incarceration. His argument is that fixing the education problems up front would actually be far more cost-effective in the long run.
Okay, but some people argue it's not just about money in failing areas. They say it's about bad ideas passed down. What's Dalio's take on schools fixing that?
He acknowledges the family influence is huge, but still sees schools as having a vital role. He agrees with principles like accountability, key performance indicators, being able to remove underperformers,
And paying teachers well.
and competitive wages to attract top talent, not just people with good intentions. But he also pushes back and says you can't ignore the reality. For teachers working in really tough, under-resourced environments, that's a massive factor too.
So just pouring money into the current system wouldn't fix it alone.
He seems to think you need both accountability and quality and adequate basic resources. He mentioned, for example, students not even having computers during COVID. That's a basic resource gap.
Right, and you see some charter schools maybe getting results through discipline and high expectations, not just more cash.
That's part of the complex picture, yeah. Ultimately, Dalio seems to agree the education issue is incredibly complex, and he doesn't sound optimistic that it will be materially improved under the current shifts he sees happening. He kind of chalks that up as a con in his overall analysis.
Okay, so a big, persistent challenge. Finally, before we wrap this deep dive, Dalio has this charitable thing he's been doing for ages, right? T-Best.
Ah, yes. T-Best, which stands for Tis Better. For years, he's been pushing this idea. Instead of giving material gifts for holidays, consider donating to a charity in someone's name.
Why?
The rationale is pretty simple. Reduce wasteful spending on stuff people might not even want, and channel that money towards causes that actually make a difference. T-Best is the organization he helped create to make that super easy.
So you can easily donate to any charity as a gift.
Exactly, for individuals, for companies. And each year, he and some friends actually give away money through it to encourage people to try it and experience that feeling of giving. So it's worth keeping an eye out for that.
Good to know. Okay, so to try and pull this all together, we've really covered a lot of ground based on Dalio's framework.
We have those 5 big forces: money, debt, internal order, international order, nature, technology.
Right. And the huge shift he sees in the world order, the move towards America first, and what that means globally and domestically.
The potential impacts like tariffs, the push for self-sufficiency, the tech war.
His critique of MMT, his call for that Manhattan Project, the beautiful deleveraging idea.
Plus his worries about potential pitfalls like leaving people behind, especially regarding education.
And those complex challenges around government efficiency, productivity, what happens to displaced workers. It's a lot.
It is. But our goal here was really to give you, the listener, a clear, concise way into these complex issues using Dalio's lens to help make sense of the powerful forces shaping our economic world right now.
Definitely. And maybe here's a final thought for you to chew on. How might these really big picture forces, the economic shifts, the geopolitical changes we've talked about, how might they actually ripple down and affect your own life, your career choices, your investments, the decisions you make day to day?
It's worth thinking about. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring Dalio's work if this sparked your interest, and just keep learning, keep asking questions about the world.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for tuning in.